Dr. Kern's working on several different research projects. Just a few of them include things such as assisted migration for future forests, climate adaptive strategies for forest management, mixed wood and mixed species forest ecology and silviculture, long-term effects of harvest gap size on tree regeneration, and long-term effects of different cutting methods. She has a long list of publications that I'm not going to try to summarize, but she has been very active and very, very productive in her role. So, Christel, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen, I'm going to turn this over to you, and I'm going to mute and just look forward to your presentation. So, Christel, it's all yours. Thank you again for joining us. Appreciate your time.
All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you for having me and having this opportunity to speak to this audience. The work I'm going to share with you are just snippets of information that's been published in recent publications coming out of a long-term silviculture study. So you can go back to these two publications for more details. The work with Sarita Basel, Ralph Nyland, and Laura Kennefic was funded by the Northeastern States Research Cooperative, and the work with Maeve Draper and Robert Froese was supported by the SFI Implementation Committee of Wisconsin and Michigan. So thanks to those funding resources, we were able to take a new look at some of this long-term data in recent years. This work was also recently highlighted in a Rooted in Research science brief. If you're on that mailing list, you would have seen this. If you're not, you can join. You can just search Rooted in Research and look for the January publication, and you can find this there and ways to sign up. So before I present some of these 65-year results, I'm going to go through a backstory because it's really important to set the context to this long-term silviculture study. And then after we look at some of the results, I'm going to move into more of a discussion with context and how this applies to where we are at today in forestry. So the backstory starts over 100 years ago when the profession of forestry was just starting and just developing here. It was a time of European settlement, and a lot of our forests were being cut over for farming, establishing new communities, and so forth. And there was this growing push from the public to move away from what was happening and they're pressing for more near natural forestry practices, something more sustainable. And at the same time, early foresters and silviculturists that at that time were just beginning to write the first textbooks and so forth were very interested in this idea of sustained yield concept, where you didn't have to cut over that forest to get the resources you needed. You could come back to that forest multiple times over decades and continue to have sustained yield. So it was in this early period that many of our national forests and experimental forests were established in the United States. Today, we have over 80 of them across the US. These are outdoor laboratories where scientists can observe natural processes and also experiment with different treatments. These experimental forests are home to watershed studies, wildlife studies, and silviculture studies. The silviculture studies in particular have been important foundational data resources, which have been the basis for many of the forestry guides across the United States. The work in experimental forests could be at the individual tree, stand, or at a larger landscape and network scale. One of those early experimental forests that was established was the Duke's Experimental Forest, located in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. At that time, at establishment, it was not cut over. So this forest was established in, you could think, first growth, not second growth. Today, that forest is over 5,000 acres in size and continues to have long-term silviculture studies on it. When this was established in 1923, much of the northern hardwood range had been cut over. And so there was a lot of concerns about timber shortages as that cutover was occurring across this large landscape and what were going to be the economic fallout for communities. In the 1920s, when the Dukes was established, about a third of the Upper Peninsula was not cut over. So it was still in this first growth, old growth condition. And so when it was established, the idea was to start testing different silvicultural practices of sustained yield on that forest condition. It was thought at that time that these northern hardwood forests had multiple age classes in them. The species were dominated by shade tolerance, and these forests also, they observed this gap dynamic, so frequent light disturbances. So it seemed well suited to try something like the selection system, which had been proven sustainable, and this supported the sustained yield concept in Europe. And so the idea was to begin trying that here in the US on northern hardwoods. And this wasn't just an interest of the foresters and the silviculturists at that time, but coming from these communities and industry as well. So here you're looking at the original footprint of the Duke's Experimental Forest, which at that time was called the Upper Peninsula Forest. And it was a half section of land owned by Cleveland Cliffs Incorporated, which was an industry interested in mining and timber. And so they were concerned about their timber interests and wanted to pursue this idea of sustained yield and trying to sustain some of that late successional first growth, old growth forest that they had at that time with some of these partial cutting methods. And it really wasn't clear, what would be the appropriate method of how to manage this on this sustained yield. So what you're looking at here is these boxes. The white boxes are research plots that they put in. Research at that time is that they would put in one large plot inside of a treatment. So those were 1 to 6 acres in size, so quite large plots. And then the hashing you see on here are those different silvicultural trials that they were attempting at that time. So the research was monitoring these different partial cutting methods and looking at the outcome of those over time. And I should mention too that there was a lot of controversy about using partial cutting methods, a lot of concerns about doing partial harvest would result in a lot of blowdown and a loss of economic gains because it was thought you had to take everything, then take all the best trees and so forth. And then there's of course other groups that were thinking the sustained yield and partial harvest could be sustainable, and you could continue to come back and support industry in the communities at that time. So over 20 years, they studied these different treatments with very detailed measurements, and a major publication came out in 1953. This is 128 pages long, and it covers all sorts of different details about the northern hardwoods, their ecology, the soils, insects and disease, how to handle slash, and also the results of those silvicultural treatments. And some of the results supported this notion that single tree selection was sustainable for this forest type and condition that they were studying in the Upper Peninsula. This was a lot of information to read, and it seemed like it wasn't getting out as much as it should. And Carl Arbogast joined the team in Michigan in the 1950s, and he was really intrigued by these results and felt it was important to get this information out. So he published a marking guide in 1957 that focused on just the single tree selection treatment that was one of the many treatments that they tried in that original study. Here in the Lake States, this became known as the Arbogast Guide. The idea here, again, was to keep the best trees and take out the worst. And this was opposite of what the mindset had been earlier in the century. So a very different approach to managing these forests. And the idea was you could manage this forest based on a structure. So on the graph here, you see size is on the X and density of trees is on the Y. So you have that reverse J curve, which represents few large trees, a moderate amount of medium-sized trees, and many small trees. The idea was removing defective and high-risk trees over time. With the forest type and condition that they are working in, the maximum DBH was set at 24 inches, and you could come back and harvest throughout these size classes every 15 years. So it's a 15-year cutting cycle. So in the upper right, you can see the graph I just showed you. Next to that, to the left, is the clatterbucked graph, just showing that this is an uneven age system. So that reverse J curve is composed of multiple age classes that are tended to over time. And down below in the yellow, the idea with this system and sustained yield was you'd have this black line that grows, so the trees get larger and moves to the right, which is that dark green line. It's the growth in the stand. And at the same time, you're having recruitment into that smallest merchantable size. And if you move to the right, when you're harvesting the growth from the standing crop that you're managing with that reverse J curve. So you're harvesting everything greater, in this case, 24 inches. And then you're thinning the age classes and these different size classes. And you're also at the same time creating space for recruitment into that merchantable size class. So the idea was you could keep coming in every 15 years, moving through this cycle. Here's another way to look at this. This is coming from that publication in 1953. Size, again, is on the X. And instead of tree density, we're looking at basal area across these size classes on the Y. And in the upper right, where it says overmature and defective number 1, that is what they were calling the single tree selection approach originally, because it was the idea is to take out the overmature and defective trees across all size classes. So you can see here, the dark shading is the residual growing stock that they're managing over time and harvesting anything greater than those 24 inches and harvesting the growth across all the size classes. Some of the early work also looked at residual basal area. So if I go back here, this growing stock could be larger or smaller depending on what the residual basal area would be. And some of this early work was indicating that light, which would mean a light removal or high residual basal area, could be used. The Y on this axis is growth. But when you do a light removal, you are improving growth throughout the stand, but largely in those middle size classes. And when you cut heavier, this medium and heavy removal, so a lower residual basal area, you see improved growth across all size classes, and especially into those small size classes or smaller diameter size classes. So this idea of using single tree selection in northern hardwoods is really interesting. We have a lot of memos in our files here of people asking Carl Arbogast and some of the other scientists to come and do trainings about how to apply this system. This information is still used in textbooks today and was shared and of interest across different regions of the northern hardwood range. Not only was the interest in application, but research grew from this original study in different places across the northern hardwood range in the US and in Canada. New studies occurred at the Duke's Experimental Forest, on university forests, and in other regions. So now I'm going to pivot and turn to the Argonne Experimental Forest and begin telling you a little more about the long-term research there. So when the Dukes went in, there was that component of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that was not cut over. Well, while that study was occurring over those 20 years, that part of the landscape was cut over. So by the 1950s, the Lake State forests were young second growth forests. These were pool-sized stands, not saw logs, in which the industry had been built on decades before. So there were a lot of questions. Did the results from the Duke's Experimental Forest, would they apply to these second growth forests? Or if they didn't, what would be the best option moving forward? So the Argonne was established in 1947. Today it's over 6,000 acres. This land was cut over in 1905. It was acquired by the Nicolet National Forest in the 1930s and then moved into this experimental forest management area in 1947. So one of the first studies to go in at the Argonne was the cutting method study. This research now moved into the new era of how we do science with replication. We use many small plots to monitor silvicultural treatments, which was different than what they had done at the Dukes. So at this time, the stand age was about 45 years old, largely an even age stand, full size. The treatments here were focused on comparing even-aged treatments versus uneven-aged treatments, and how would these affect some of the growth and yield outcomes of these young second growth forests. Some of these treatments have been maintained over time, such as the selection treatments, the diameter limit, which is an 8-inch stump or 7-inch DBH, has been cut twice since 1951. The treatments at the Argonne Experimental Forest are often loosely called selection treatments, but we have to keep in mind that these are basically even age stands. So in the upper right, when we talked about selection system and uneven age stands, that's what we see in the upper right. But on the left is what you would expect in an even age stand. So again, size is on the X, tree density on the Y, and it's a bell-shaped curve. For the Argonne Experimental Forest, when this experiment started, it was a pole-size stand. So the majority of the trees were pole-sized. The idea with a selection-like approach was that you could start cutting across the different diameter classes in the merchantable range. So that's what the red line is marking, and the arrow suggesting the diameter classes that you could harvest in. You could cut across those, take a portion of those different size classes, and maintain a residual reverse J structure. And you could, over time, with this type of approach, develop an uneven age stand over time. So it'd be the same idea that you're cutting into this reverse J curve. There's going to be growth and recruitment, and then you have the harvest, the tending, and the recruitment all happening at the same time as you cut through the different diameter size classes and at your maximum DBH. The thought early on when I look at the memos of this study was that after 3 of these selection-like cuttings, you could develop an uneven age structure because you would have at each cutting cycle a new age class coming into the stand. And the goal of this was to produce high quality saw logs continually over time. So every cutting cycle you're producing high quality saw logs because you've been doing this tending in those smaller age classes over time, and you're having continuous recruitment into that smallest merchantable size class. And it was still of the mindset that these forests, even though they were pull size, it was really focused on developing high quality saw logs as soon as possible. Some of the earlier work at the Dukes indicated that for residual basal areas below 50 feet squared per acre were areas for concern if your goal was high quality saw timber, because there were so many low set limbs, epicormics, and so forth. So it was thought residual basal areas greater than 50 would be suitable. And with some of that work suggesting something between 60 and 90 would be suitable, you could maintain low mortality across that residual basal area. Your survival growth, which is your crop trees, are maintaining good growth across that range, and so forth. So when this study was set up, it was looking at 3 different residual basal areas for these selection-like harvests. And those were 60, 75, and 90 residual feet squared per acre. For the data that I'll be showing, these have been cut 7 times since 1951 on a 10-year cutting cycle. So we have a lot of data. I'm focusing on some of the growth and yield metrics in the presentation today. And the information I'm sharing isn't the first time that these results have been shared. There's a long record of publications coming from the Argonne Experimental Forest. So you can search in any search engine, put in tree search, and you'll come to the Forest Service's database of government publications and journal articles. And if you search for Argonne, many of these publications can come up for you. So again, you can find more information in past publications there. This work also over the decades has been used in different management guides in the region. And here's 2 examples from Wisconsin of the data being used in the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Silviculture Guide and the Schwamgennicke National Forest Plan. So the opportunity with some of the recent funding was to revisit these studies after 65 years. Some of the information I'm going to show you here is focused on some conventional timber metrics, so thinking about growth, mortality, yield, and quality. And we also wanted to look at financial performance. So in this presentation, we aren't looking at things like ecosystem, social, and other metrics. The hypotheses for this revisit of the data was reviewing earlier results, which suggested that treatments that continually produce high quality saw timber also produce high quality residuals in the stand, and those would support the best financial performance. Specifically, this was the even age, uneven age treatments, or the selection-like treatments would be better at producing high quality saw timber. Earlier results suggested the medium, which is the 75 residual basal area, had the greatest increase in tree grade, and the heavy selection had the best financial performance. So here are some of the results. Because I snipped this out of one of the publications, the codes at the bottom, we have a diameter limit 18, which is, these are metric, but that would be the diameter limit at 7-inch DBH. And then I also have circled there the single tree selection 14, that is the 60. So the 3 selection-like treatments are the 60, 75, and the 90, which are represented on this graph by the 14, 70, and 21. You're looking at the components of growth in different decades across time. And with the arrows there, I'm just highlighting the high amount of growth that we're seeing in recent decades. In the diameter limit, which would make sense because that removed a great amount of volume, and also in the lower residual basal area of the selection-like treatment, the 60. Here's a look at mortality, very low mortality, and something like the selection treatment with residual basal area of 60, and very high mortality in the control, the uncut, unmanaged stand. When applying these selection-like treatments, it's important that at each cutting cycle, you're only removing the growth and maintaining that residual growing stock. And so with net growth and that calculation should be around 0 if you're not taking more than what the stand is producing. And as you can see here over the decades, the 3 single tree selection treatments are hovering right around that 0 line, compared to something like the diameter limit treatment, which there's no, is really simply cutting back to 7-inch DBH multiple times. Over the decades, it was twice. In the time period we're looking at, it was a very irregular net growth pattern here. Here's a look at volume. The green is that growing stock. That is, that base volume is being maintained over the decades. Again, these being harvested 7 times. The selection treatments anyway, 7 times over the time period we're looking at. Over these decades, you can see the cull that's coming out, specifically looking in the harvested, less cull coming out of the harvested portions of the stand, and a good amount of volume always coming out, but a large residual base being maintained over time. Here's looking at the harvested volume and specifically at the tree quality coming out so tree grade. So the brighter, more intense the color means grade 1. If it's a very light shade, that means grade 3, which is poor quality. And then the different colors represent the different treatments in this analysis. And the 3 I've circled there are the 3 selection treatments, the 60, 75, and 90. And so you can see the selection treatments are bringing out or are resulting in higher quality logs coming out of the stand. And the heavy and the medium selection, or the 60 and the 75, have a greater percent grade 1 trees coming out compared to the light or the 90 selection. This is the residual stand. So another goal with these selection-like treatments was to be improving that growing stock in the residual stand. So you can see here over the decades, there's an increase in the residual stands grade 1 trees and a decrease in grade 3 over time. Here I've just highlighted the 60, how it has had a consistent trend of increasing grade 1 and decreasing grade 3 over time. This is a measure of financial performance called the managed forest value. It considers the repeatability of the harvest, the sustainability, incorporating both volume and tree grade into the calculation. And the results show from right to left increasing value, financial value of the stand. So something like the diameter limit had very low financial value compared to the selection treatments. And the lower the residual basal area, the higher the financial value. There's a lot more that you can look at. I've just pulled out a few things to share with you. So now let's discuss some of the things that I've shared with you and just talk a little bit of context of what this might mean. So in general, what this particular study is showing in a second growth forest in northern Wisconsin that's been managed since 1951 on a 10-year cutting cycle with selection-like treatments is that the lower residual basal areas are consistently over the decades have greater growth, lower mortality, more harvested value, and more grade 1, both in the residual stand and coming out of the stand, and had better financial performance. The higher residual basal area, so if you look in that graph at the top, meaning we're moving that black line, that curve higher, so keeping a standing crop with more trees in the stand, you have that higher residual volume in the stand. You are producing more larger diameter trees. There is quality in that stand, but it's being retained in the stand. So you're not seeing that in the outcome of the financial metric that we used. So in terms of some of the early ideas of working in this range, the results right now are showing in terms of these growth and yield objectives that working in this range of residual basal areas is proving, consistent growth, low mortality, improving residual stand grade, and so forth. So again, the idea was with these selection-like treatments is that you could, over time, continue to cut through the merchantable size classes, remove the growth, and through that continue to have a sustainable structure because you maintained recruitment over time. But remember, these were even age stands. So when the even age stand grows, you're really just moving that bell-shaped curve to the right. And bringing in new age classes isn't as consistent as maybe originally thought. So a new age class may come in, but it may take decades for it to get to that merchantable size class. So that means for decades, you're working with the same age class, trying to maintain that structure. This is related to some of the work that I did with Sarita Basel, Ralph Nyland, and Laura Kennefic, where we looked at some of the stand structure at the Argonne. And what you're looking at here is size class on the X and tree density on the Y, and each panel is a decade. And we're looking at one of the selection treatments. And initially, in those first few decades, the early scientists probably did think they could stabilize structure because it's pretty close to reverse J curve. But what you end up seeing over time is really that bell-shaped curve kind of breaking off and moving to the right over time. And it really isn't until the recent decades that you start to see a pulse of a new age class coming into these stands. If you'll want to see more details in these papers, we look at several different metrics to analyze this phenomena, and they all point to the same idea that after 3 cutting cycles, you don't have an uneven age stand. It's going to take many cutting cycles with this type of approach to have a stable stand structure. Some of the trade-offs with this just mean that you have in that stand some slower growers, and you don't have that vigorous age class, multiple age class distribution in the stand. So a little bit about the caveats of this work. So the results that I shared are focused on some of the original objectives of this study when it was installed in 1951. Some of the other metrics that we might think about today related to ecology or sociology are not analyzed here, but are on the to-do list for our next analysis. Another important caveat is to remember that this is a research study. So for research purposes, we were in the generations of scientists before me, the intention was to continue to do the same thing multiple times on the same stand. In practice, you would be evaluating the stand every time before you would write a prescription. At least I hope you do. Evaluating whether doing the same treatment is appropriate or do you need to pivot and do something different. So for example, in application, you may extend the cutting cycle if growth had slowed down because maybe it was a dry decade or something like that. Or maybe the basal area can be adjusted at each cutting cycle. So there's a lot of flexibility in applying something like this. But for the purposes of research, what I presented is a very, strict reapplication of the same thing over these 65 years. And another important caveat is this work started when these stands were only 45 years old. They're even aged. The stands that these are in don't have a high component of beech and some of the other issues that you find in different parts of the northern hardwood range. And we're in the continental climate of northern Wisconsin. So keep that in mind when you think about how this might apply to where you're at across that northern hardwood range. If you're in a stand that's, at 180 BA, taking it down to 60 or 75, if that was of interest based on these results, that probably is not appropriate to do if your goal is growth and yield, because you're probably going to see a lot of epicormics and maybe some sun scald and some other issues that can happen when you have such a dramatic drop in basal area. In those cases, if the goal was to move to something that what you saw here in results, it would take multiple cutting cycles of slowly moving the basal area down to get the stand to that type of condition if it was of interest. Some of the important conclusions coming out of this study with some of these recent analyses is that just because you've entered the stand and done one of these partial harvests doesn't mean there is perfectly a new age class on there. We're seeing it's going to take multiple cutting cycles to establish multiple age classes and stabilize stand structure in this. And we do know the multiple age classes in a stable structure is possible, again, based on that work at the Duke's Experimental Forest, which was an uneven age stand when those studies were applied. Some of the heavier removals in the study are showing really consistent, and I went back through some of the earlier publications, good growth, low mortality, and at this point in time, the 60 and the 75 are really and statistically similar in producing really similar results in tree quality and value coming out of these stands. The higher residual basal area for selection-like treatments have some trade-offs. And for the original objectives, wasn't meeting those as well as the 60 and the 75. But that doesn't mean when there's other objectives for these stands, such as wildlife habitat, maybe aesthetics, cultural reasons. There's all sorts of different reasons why you might use a higher residual basal area. They just weren't part of the original objectives of this study, but we still can, in a future analysis, look at some of these other types of benefits and goals in northern hardwood stands at these higher residual basal areas. In general, the trends that we're seeing early on are being maintained, and as we continue to look at these results for their original objective and then come in with our new perspectives in modern times and look at the data, they just continue to highlight and provide new trends. So it's, I guess, pretty awesome to be able to be working for the Forest Service, who has some of these long-term studies, and just that they've been maintaining these over time, and that we have these opportunities to come in and look decades back, because that's hard to do, right? It's really hard to get studies installed today and then somehow fast forward 50 years to see what those results were. So it's a really good opportunity to have these studies. So there are experimental forests across the region, all the different states. I even think I saw some states from out west. So I would encourage you to get a hold of whether that's a university property or a Forest Service property or a state property, to get out and see your experimental forest and look at what some of these long-term outcomes are. I know if you come out to the Argonne and you look at these different stands, it's striking how different the structure, composition, and so forth are in these stands. You really can see it. So that I will wrap up then. I covered the backstory to the long-term study called the cutting method study at Argonne. We talked a little bit about some of the context of what these results mean. And I am happy to answer any questions. You can contact me by my email. If you want to look up some of the other results from this recent analysis, you can look for that Rooted in Research Science briefing, or look at the journal articles that came out in 2019 and 2021. Thank you so much.
Christel, thank you. This was very neat, and we've already got some questions coming in from Karen, and other people can throw questions into the chat. I'm going to start, though, if I can, with more of a administrative question. How do you keep, I'm just amazed at the ability of the Forest Service and you and others to keep track of this data over decades and decades. I mean, I struggle between Monday and Friday to keep track of what I'm doing. So how do you, and without going into all of the detail, but how is that managed so that you can find the data and relocate the plots? What are some of the things that you do to make that possible?
Yeah, so it's really important to have, good metadata, good notes. Been really fortunate with some of the work at the Argonne Experimental Forest and at the Duke's Experimental Forest that, the generations of scientists and technicians before me took incredible notes and had very organized files. Some of my predecessors, kept up with the changing technology to keep changing, the format of the data. So for something like the cutting method study, that was handed off to me in a digital format with software I could use. So, that's been fortunate, good file keeping. And then at this point in time, we're converting that to tablets. So when we go to remeasure these sites, it's instantly electronic and, auto-populating and stuff like that. The Duke's Experimental Forest data, that is available online through the Forest Service Research Data Archive. We will here in the future be getting out the Argon data as well. So the Duke's data is shared freely. That said, I've talked about basically 2 different long-term studies, and there's many of them on these experimental forests. So some of them don't have, as good of records, and they're more difficult to piece together what's happened, which means at this point in time with limited resources, we aren't able to maintain those studies. These key ones like a cutting method study, though, we do make a priority. And at this point, it's a very small investment to keep moving them forward. The big investments were made decades ago when they put them in. And then that cumulative over time to have this incredible data set.
Very neat. Very neat. Thank you for sharing all this. So, can you see in terms how do you want me to assist or not with questions? Can you see the questions?
Yes.
Okay. So, you want me so you can read them and you can answer them, or I
Sure.
can read them and you can answer them? What's going to be best for you?
Um, how about you read them and I'll answer them?
Okay. All right. So I'll just get back to Karen Bennett. Karen wants to know, was the goal to have the remaining trees evenly distributed, or was the remaining stocking patchy after each harvest?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Because the goal was to have them evenly distributed. However, what was found, especially in that residual basal area of 60, because it was so low, that they found they had to make basically canopy gaps because of the spacing, and they were coming in every 10 years. And it was in the 80s that Gus Erdman and others had noticed in the 60, in these gaps that they had to make to maintain the residual basal area, that they were seeing more diversity. The 60s tended to have more yellow birch coming into it. So that spun off into a study that started in the 1990s with Terry Strong, looking at different group sizes, or what we in the Lake States are calling just gaps, putting in harvest gaps. And, that observation of a patchy distribution led to some more silvicultural experiments and application that here in the Lake States were often intentionally, with these selection like harvests, adding harvest gaps to, intentionally have recruitment and promote diversity in these stands.
Okay. Matt wants to know, asks, did the clear-cut area of the study plot regenerate with more shade-intolerant species, or have traditional northern hardwood species moved back into those areas?
That's a good question. Yeah, so the clear cut areas were cut in 1951. They were cut one clear cut. Well, I should say this. The clear cut treatments were split. One was merchantable clear cut, so everything 4.5 inches and larger was harvested. And there was a component of sugar maple growing under sugar maple. So those stands regenerated as sugar maple. Now, they did also have saplings of sugar maple left. So those saplings that were released with that commercial clear cut grew huge crowns, set low branches, had probably a nice park-like feeling at some point. But today, there is a lot of defect in that stand. It's mostly sugar maple. Now, the other half of the clear cut was treated as a silvicultural treatment. So everything down to 1 inch was harvested. In that stand, it was interesting. Pictures and notes in the file show that for 15 years, it was grasses and berries. But the forest did come back, but it's 15 years younger than that, other half of the clear cut. But it is more diverse. So you'll see more birch, ash, and other species in there. Some more diversity in the silvicultural clear cut.
Okay. Peter wants to know if you could speak to the use of hybrid approaches like gaps and irregular shelterwood for regeneration development as well as economic outputs.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think, that's what's been happening in the landscape over here. And, I just described that of, observations of losing diversity, not getting that recruitment from new age classes. When we don't get a new age class, it just means it's an old tree and it can't respond to the dynamics of the silvicultural treatments that you're putting into that stand versus a young tree can grow quickly um, and fight off diseases and insects and so forth, just more resilient if you have more age classes in there. So during the past 10 years, there's been a lot of interest in irregular shelter wood, which is just a lot more flexibility than being so rigid with the reverse J curve, which I showed you here, which, was coming out of some of that early work at the Dukes and influencing the work at the Argonne of very this idea of sustained yield concept. With all the challenges that we face in our forests today, I think we're all recognizing we need a lot of flexibility to meet our goals, and something like a regular shelter wood where you can have multiple basal areas, you can have openings like gaps for regeneration, and also be working on multiple age classes at one time, just provide a lot more flexibility and adaptability to the stand conditions as they change over the site. And ideally with that, because of the flexibility, then you're going to see more meeting your financial goals, whatever those are, because you're adapting and being flexible across the stand.
Mike wants to know, have the same extraction trails been used with each harvest? So skid trails been reused, and has the harvesting method changed significantly over time at the site? If so, are smaller trees more or less susceptible to damage now?
Um, I I think the same trails have been used. They're evident, you can see them. So that's what it looks like to me over time. That's not all confirmed in our files, but it looks that way. And we don't see much regeneration on those trails. And has the harvesting method changed over time? Yes, so they would have been using whatever the method was at the time. Um, So something like at the Duke's Experimental Forest, it would have started off with horse logging and then, using the latest equipment in the last harvest, which occurred in 2008. So yes, that is kind of an interesting thing to think about too, is how the impacts of the different logging equipment could be affecting the stands as well. Let's see, and if so, are small trees more or less susceptible to damage now? Um, I guess I'm not, Peter, do you have an insight on what was meant there?
I don't know. I'm
Okay.
guessing it's relative to the harvesting method.
Okay, right.
Um, but you may also have more small trees now because you're creating these gaps. So they're, I guess maybe how much damage is there to small trees?
Right.
We can reframe the question to as well.
Right. And that's a good question. I haven't looked at the regen data. So that would be something important to look at and something to look at with our next harvest coming up. So I don't know that answer offhand.
Okay. Ernie asks, what was your typical tree marking direction? I think instruction. The
Mhm.
stands that are dominated by poles at the beginning, and then how did that instruction from tree marking change successive cuts to move
Mhm.
the stand to a more uneven aged condition?
It was always thinking about moving lower quality, high risk trees first, and then moving into size class distribution. So there was an order of removal. Um, and because these stands aren't stabilized. They aren't balanced reverse J curve. So we weren't applying the selection system in its, purest sense. It was about improving the quality and trying to develop that uneven age stand over time with these selection-like treatments.
Okay. Todd asks, first he says, great work. And he says, I'm wondering, the financials were only for current stand value or also considered, I'm guessing, cumulative harvest yield values over time. He's wondering about concern in New York about the severe lack of recruitment with lighter harvests. Do you have deer impact issues in your experimental forests? So two questions. One about if the
Yeah.
financial values were cumulative or current, and then about deer impacts.
Mhm. Yeah, so from my understanding of the financial metric we use is that we use that because it did include the harvest yields over time and including that residual stand value over time. Um, you can follow up with me on that. I leaned on Robert Frost. That's why I worked with him at Michigan Tech at the time because that was his area of expertise that he could bring to evaluating this data. In terms of lack of recruitment with these lighter harvests, I think we're seeing some of the same thing here in the lake states, kind of depending where you are in the landscape. And yes, deer impacts are having an issue. For these particular stands, and the Argonne, we did have a harvest next to this research study in about 2008, and we had incredible regeneration came back. So, and that was kind of a surprise to us because we had been saying there's a lot of deer impact issues in these stands. But we have seen some successful natural regeneration, just indicating, the deer impacts change over time. But certainly in the lake states, there are areas where we're having major concerns about the impact of deer on northern hardwood tree regeneration.
Okay. Karen follows up, wants to know how large the gaps were. And she just points out, so Karen's in New Hampshire. She's done work with the Bartlett Experimental Forest. Just points out that your um, results with diversity and gap aligns with what they've learned at the Bartlett. So she's curious, how big were your gaps?
Yeah, yeah. So some of the work here is showing, I think at the Bartlett, some of the results are showing larger gaps work well. The gaps here in the lake states are a little smaller, I think, than what's been used over there. The research study I was referring to looked at canopy gaps that were created by removing one tree. So about like 10 feet in diameter to a half acre in size. And what we've been finding from there is that um, when we get between 60-foot diameter and up to that half acre size, there's a pivot point with trees coming back or raspberry coming back. And it's been over 25 years and we still have raspberry patches and some of these medium to large gaps. Some of that is perpetuated by the deer that continually to come in there and browse in there. And some of it's that the raspberry is creating such dark conditions, we're not seeing the tree regeneration coming in, or it's starting to come in along the edges and slowly shade out the raspberry as it encroaches towards the center of these gaps. So in practice, in some sites, gaps between 30 and 60 feet are providing good regeneration and good diversity into these stands. And in other areas where there are concerns about deer, earthworms, and some other challenges, we're not seeing always as much success with those. So there's a lot of context with understanding your site and some of some of the obstacles if you're going to be using these canopy gaps to bring in a new age class and diversity.
So you found the 30 to 60 feet diameter or radius is
Diameter.
diameter. Okay. I assume that's what it was, but I just wanted to
Yeah.
make sure. Okay. Mark wants to know if the lower residual basal area resulted in more yellow birch because of surface disturbance, or if it was some other factor. Maybe you know the mechanism that
Yeah,
triggered the yellow birch.
that is a great question and something that was not tested. The observations at the time was the thought it was about the light and creating more openness in the canopy. But you're right, with the different equipment that could have been used there, there could have been more soil disturbance, just meeting the needs of that. So that would be an interesting question to tease out.
Okay. Chuck says, um, he says you stated that more than 7 cuttings were needed for a stable structure. I want to know what you mean by stable structure and whether that is that these 7 different cuttings create 3 distinct age classes, um, or if 7 cuttings were created one new age class.
Yeah, so what did I mean? I meant by stable structure having at least 3 age classes and that reverse J curve is maintained. So it's like I drew on that picture, like it's there, there's some growth, you cut back to it and you maintain that over time. So it's an uneven age stand. But it's what we're seeing though is even though we've cut it 7 times in the merchantable size classes, we're seeing about 2 age classes. So like one was created over time. And so all these 7 cuttings have been managing the one and now the two. And it's going to take additional selection like treatments to have it a truly uneven age stand.
Okay. He further asked, you have the pre-harvest stand stocking and basal area for each treatment and tracked how that changed over the years.
Yeah, so the pre-harvest stand stocking for each treatment, um, let's see, I might even have a graph of it.
So I'm assuming this would be like pre and post harvest stand
Right.
stocking at each iteration.
Yeah, so it's accumulating over time. Um, oh, I guess I can't quickly share that, but yeah, it's increasing over time along with the control. So it's, a tracking as an even age stand and that it's, and with the cutting, bringing in recruitment and growing over time. The diameter limit treatments, something like that though, would have a very irregular pattern over time.
Okay. So are there so several people are joining in here thanking you and saying what an excellent job this was, which I agree with. And I'll say unless somebody comes in with something kind of maybe a final question. When I think about trying to mark a stand to move it towards an arbogast distribution, that strikes me as being very complicated
Mm-hmm.
just to keep track of it. How does someone go about learning how to do that, or are there tricks or techniques that can be developed or that you would apply that would help you with that? Do you have any insights into how that happens?
Yeah, it is complicated. And we rarely have stands that are actually uneven aged with this type of structure to manage it this way. So it's not used very often. Um, but when I've helped with trainings with different groups that have come through the Argonne, typically whatever organization is, they have something like a spreadsheet which looks at the stand structure, where it is now, what the residual basal area is now, and then what is the target residual basal area? How does that look across that diameter distribution? And then you can see where it's overstocked in those size classes. And it'll tell you, you need to take out do a calculation. You need to cut every fifth tree between, 15 and 16 inches, or, it'll have it broke down so you have kind of where the stand is at now, where
Cutting
you would like
ratio or
it.
something.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So you can use something like a spreadsheet, and I'm sure there's some other tools out there to help calculate that. And then when you're in the stand, when you're deciding on every fifth tree or every other tree in that size class that you're taking out, then you would have your order of removal criteria, taking out the worst trees, leaving the best, and if it's over the maximum DBH and so forth.
Hmm. Okay. I've seen Dr. Nyland give presentations like that in New York, and just it still seems maybe maybe more than what my brain is capable of. So that Peter Williams has another question here. Is there a real benefit to have the real uneven age structure rather than the almost real with the greater diversity? What is
Yeah,
there something magical about that pure uneven age structure?
no, and it's going to be on landowner goals, and how that works out in the age classes, the structure, the composition, etc. Managing that to meet the goals of the landowners, what's most important. Being that I'm a researcher, we're always interested in theory and textbook and testing these original ideas. We have these experiments set up at the Argonne and the Dukes that, are set up to test some of these original ideas and sustained yields. So someone like me is always interested in them and, testing whether they're true or not supported. So yeah, so in terms of that of research, kind of providing the basis foundational information, someone like me is always going to be interested in that. But in application, it's going to come down to meeting the goals of the landowner and using the right silvicultural tool to move to that desired future condition.
Perfect. Great closure to the noon session. Thank you so much, Crystal, and thank you. We had 137 people on, so thanks to all of you for joining in. We'll be back again at 7 o'clock with the same presentation, or we always skip August and we'll see you in September to learn more about hemlock adelgid. So thank you all. Have a great afternoon. Crystal, I'll see you in a few hours.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you very much.